Hello everybody, my name's Megan and I am the convener and tutor for education in diversity in secondary education. Quite a mouthful, that name, isn't it? Don't understand why we need education twice in the title, but that's not my thing to control. So I'd like to start by acknowledging the country on which we are meeting today. I am standing on Ngunnawal and Ngambri country. I was born on the lands of the Yawatjali people near the Garawerret, which White Australia calls the Grampians. I'd like to acknowledge the ongoing connection to country of Australia's Indigenous peoples, their histories, their cultures, and to note that this land was never ceded. I'd like to pay my respects to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander elders and to any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people who are joining us today. I'd like you to pause the recording now because there will be multiple points during this lecture where you need to stop and write some stuff down. So you need something to write with and something to write on. That's fine if that's digital, not a drama. And it would be helpful if you had a device to keep track of time, because I'm going to give you set periods of time to do some tasks. Now, I want you to make sure that you always can access your notes from lectures and from tutorials, because as your understanding of diversity and inclusion grow, you'll be wanting to come back to look at where you started, where you finished, and also the things that we covered and the things that you thought were important. And this will help you with your assessment. So hopefully you're all now back again. So let's keep going on to our next task. So these are what I'd call the learning provocations for the unit as a whole. I'm going to go through what I'm expecting of you and logistics. We're going to talk about what inclusion is, who we're including, why we're including, and we're going to look at the Australian Professional Standards for Teachers in some detail in relation to how they are addressed across this unit. And these are our 4 unit outcomes, which link very closely to the Australian Professional Standards for Teachers. Now, in terms of some housekeeping, we're going to work through a whole pile of things like that. So attendance is compulsory in a class like this. If you're obviously, there may be times when you are unable to attend, so you need to provide evidence to support your non-attendance. And if you're happy to show me evidence of you having completed all of the workload or the work that was covered in the week that you were away, I'll note that you attended in an alternative way. We have a textbook, which you need to be reading, and we have a Canvas site, which you need to be accessing. Hopefully you're accessing the Canvas site right now so that you can access this lecture. If you're going to contact me via email, as I've said on the Canvas site, please note that I am not on campus on Wednesdays. I'm part-time. I don't work Wednesdays. I don't answer my emails on Wednesdays. And I don't answer my emails on the weekends unless we're in the middle of working on an assessment item. Then I might look at my email on the weekend. But please don't rely on sending me an email on a Wednesday or on a weekend and expecting an answer that day. That's not going to happen. If you have questions about assessment tasks, I'd encourage you to post them on the discussion forum on Canvas. If you have questions about the unit in general, I'd invite you to You can email me privately, but if there's the sort of thing that other people might want to talk about as well, it's best that it goes into a discussion forum. This is our textbook, fairly self-explanatory. It's available at School Locker. Now, the resources for this unit, the goal is to have the resources available on Canvas 2 weeks in advance. So as of week 1, weeks 1, 2 and 3 should be available for you. The pre-workshop activities include the recorded lectures, the set readings, any other pre-learning activities that I'm hoping you will complete before the workshops. Now, research tells us that you will get much better outcomes from the workshops if you have completed the pre-workshop activities. You will retain more information if you are not encountering the information in the workshops for the first time. Now you'll find a weekly schedule that looks something like that in the unit outline. The unit outline, of course, is available as a link from Canvas. Now it's time for you to pause the recording. I want you for 2 minutes to write down every word that comes into your head when you hear the word diversity. Off you go. I'm going to do it to you again. This time, instead of diversity, I want you to write down everything that comes to mind when you think about the word inclusion. You may not get as many results as you did from the word diversity. We'll see what happens. I want you to get at least 3. Maximum 2 minutes. And this is the last one of these in this section. Okay, so this time we're going to think about inclusive education. So, what are your thoughts about inclusive education? How many can you get in 2 minutes? Hopefully you can get at least 3. Welcome back. Looking at what you had written down, it's likely that your ideas about diversity related to some of these elements, because these are common elements of diversity for characteristics of students from diverse backgrounds. But schools can also be diverse in and of themselves. And there's some examples here of different types of schools. Inclusion, though, is a significant concept, and it's not that shiny, fuzzy stuff that you might have that you can see in that list there. Inclusion is not disability porn is not inclusion. We'll explore that concept later on. Inclusion is a right, and it's an ongoing process. And when we are being inclusive educators, we are working through a process which never stops. We go around this circle constantly. We need always to be re-evaluating and reflecting on what we're doing in our inclusive practice. So this is what inclusive education is. And I'm very, very passionate about inclusive education. Unfortunately, we haven't absolutely managed inclusive schools in this country. We're definitely doing better than we were, but we definitely haven't got all the way there yet. And you'll understand what I'm meaning by that as we go through this lecture. I'm going to have a look at some concepts about inclusion. So, as I've said here, we've got census data on diversity. We know about the diversity of our country, of all of our states and territories, all of our communities. We have census data on diversity in our schools. And it's a very simple statement that our classrooms should reflect the community in which they're based. And as we saw from some of those earlier statistics, they do. This is our core business, these concepts here. It is what we do is we welcome and value our students. We are setting up our classrooms and our learning experiences to ensure that all of our students are participating and belonging, and that all of the necessary supports are there and just a part of our normal everyday practice. Now, of course, when it comes to supports for inclusion, dropping back to that wheel, the type of supports are going to vary over time. Students join us, students leave, students mature, technology changes. We have to be looking at all of those things. We'll talk further about support staff, but if we have them, they need to be working inclusively too. For me, the most important concept within inclusive education are these last two. Our students need to be involved in all aspects of their learning, and they need to be flourishing in not just marking time in our classrooms, but flourishing in our classrooms. Sometimes it's easiest to define what inclusion is by defining what it isn't. And macro exclusion, segregation is a form of macro exclusion. This is where we are denying access to formal education, to general education settings, to children and young people. And this still happens all around the world today. It still happens in Australia today. There are children and young people who are denied access to formal education because of their disabilities. There is segregation happening in Australian schools. We have special schools, we have LSUs, we have ASUs. We have separate classes for students with disability. These are all forms of macro exclusion. Micro exclusion is a bit less obvious, but it's probably actually more pervasive than macro exclusion. Micro exclusion happens when a student is not viewed as a valuable member of our classroom and our school community, but is viewed as a burden. Micro exclusion is often considered to be inclusion, and it's used as an example of why inclusion doesn't work. I don't know how many times I have heard a teacher say, "Oh, I have this student with special needs in my classroom, and it just creates more work for me because I have to create special work for them to do with their LSA." Those teachers think they're being inclusive, but what they're actually doing is excluding the child from the activities and the learning that's happening in the classroom. There are many ways that micro exclusions can happen, such as what we can see in this cartoon here, where the school is open and everybody is welcome, but if you need wheelchair access, you can't come in the same door as everybody else. You've got to go around the back. And if you're in special ed, just go around the side. Gatekeepers are fantastic at their jobs. They are very good at excluding people in ways that don't actually look like exclusion. An example from the US, when at the end of the American Civil War, when former slaves were allowed to vote, many southern states introduced literacy requirements for people to vote. Now, those literacy requirements didn't apply to people who'd been registered to vote before the end of the Civil War. It only applied to voters who came in after the end of the Civil War. So effectively, it was blocking access to the democratic process to black people. Or let's look at it another way, banning people from the mall if they don't have shoes. What minority groups in our society are we banning from our shopping centres if we say you can't come in here without shoes on? I would suggest, particularly in places like Western Australia and the Northern Territory, the people would be banning would mostly be Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. Think about, have you ever been in a classroom where there were rewards for people with 100% attendance? Now think about the student who has chronic illness or injury. How do they feel? Do they feel included in their classroom when they have no hope of ever achieving 100% attendance? This is a lovely visual of inclusion, exclusion, segregation, and integration. So we can see that in inclusion, everybody is in the same space, doing the same stuff, working together. And it may be that there are, depending on how we set up the learning, there might be some people in here who need some assistance. That is entirely possible. Whereas in exclusion, we've got a whole bunch of people who can't even get into the room. Under segregation, they still can't get into the room, but they're grouped together. So they're no longer alone. They have access to something. They just don't have access to what everybody else has. And in integration, all of our people with different learning needs are physically in the space, but they're grouped by their difference rather than being a part of the group. So they are together but apart. This is what we're looking for, inclusion. So why do we need to be inclusive? Because it's the law. It's very simple. It is illegal for classroom teachers to discriminate against a student because of their disability. And the disability standards for education tell us what areas of education it is illegal to discriminate against students in. Now, we'll explore both of these significant pieces of legislation and policy and practice in much greater detail in the next couple of weeks. But the other reason why we want to be inclusive is because diversity is the lived reality of our world and of our classrooms. Discrimination is actually immoral. We have 1 in 10, 9-point-something% of school students have a disability, and most students with a disability go to mainstream schools. 86% of them go to mainstream schools. Why would we deliberately act to exclude, deliberately or subconsciously act to exclude 1 in 10 of our students? Other ways in which diversity is reality. Let's have a think about instead of just thinking about students with disability, let's have a quick look at some other minority groups. So in 2014, between 4 and 10% of students surveyed identified as gay or bisexual. Now I have to say, in my lived experience, this current cohort of secondary school students is the queerest cohort I have ever worked with. So I think we're much closer to the 10% than we are to the 4. And the other stats on this slide are quite horrifying. 61% of lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, intersex and asexual young people report experiencing verbal homophobic abuse, and 18% of them report physical homophobic abuse. I know that one of my students during the equal marriage plebiscite period was held on the ground with a knife to her throat because she was queer. We have a duty of care to our students, and we need to work to prevent these types of stats being reality. So whether or not you agree with a young person's sexual or gender identity, you are not allowed to discriminate against them because of their sexuality or their gender identity. Let's think about language as a form of diversity. So we've got those 1 in 4 students that learn English as a second or an additional language. And there is a huge range of competence in English, of literacy within that group. So some of them have had little or no formal schooling and have had severely disrupted education, like refugee students. Some students who come from a culturally diverse background have literacy skills in their home language which are equivalent to or greater than their school-age peers here in Australia. Some students have minimal or no literacy experiences in any language. When I was second year out, I was teaching home economics at Belconnen High School, and I had in my Year 9 international cooking class a young man from Sudan who'd spent nearly half his life in refugee camps. He could not read and write in Dinka, let alone in English. On the flip side of that, there are Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander students who may have 4 or 5 languages that they have learnt before they've learnt English. And they are also functioning in Aboriginal English, which is different to academic English. So they're running a very complicated world. Religion is another area in which Australian classrooms are increasingly diverse. You can see the decrease from 1966 to 2016, decrease in people who identified as Christian, and the increase in people who identified as having no religion. That's all census data. And this is expanding out some of those other religions. And you'll see in the dark green there, the growth of people who follow the Islamic faith from 2006 in the light green to 2016 in the dark green. And you'll also see a small growth in Sikhism and Hinduism. Buddhism realistically has grown and dropped. So we're going to say it's stayed pretty much stable overall. So why do we want to be inclusive? So we've talked about our legal responsibility and our moral responsibility to be inclusive. I want to flip this on its head a bit. And why would we not want to be inclusive? I want you to think about in 2017, at a conference, one of the participants spoke about her husband, who was in his 30s, who had attended a special school. By the time he was in his 30s, every child in his class, apart from him, had died of complications of their disabilities. Why would we want to set up any student to be in a situation where at the age of 30 they had no classmates left? They had no shared history left with anybody that they'd been to school with. And as I think I've said once before, but I will say again, we will be inclusive because we know through hard qualitative data that inclusive classrooms create better outcomes for all students. Okay, so we've looked at inclusion, we've looked at diversity, we've looked at why we do it. Now, for the rest of this lecture, I'm going to focus on the professional standards for teachers and how inclusion fits, and this unit fits into the professional standards. So you'll see there that you probably already know this, but just in case, there are 7 standards. They are arranged in 3 domains, and they are separated into descriptors at 4 professional career stages. In this course, you're focusing on being graduate, achieving the standards at a graduate level. If you haven't already accessed the AITSL website and got hold of the standards, I strongly encourage you to do that because you'll need to refer to them many, many times throughout this course and all of your courses. So the first domain is about professional knowledge. Know your students and know how they learn. Know your content and your curriculum. Have a range of strategies to ensure that your students are learning and make your content meaningful. So this is what we want in our classrooms. In terms of professional knowledge, teachers develop student literacy and numeracy using information and communication technologies. So what does that actually mean? In terms of this course, in terms of Standard 1, you need to be able to demonstrate your knowledge and understanding of physical, social and intellectual development, characteristics of students and how these may affect learning. So what does learning look like for a range of students? How do students learn? You need to know about the research into how students learn and what that means for you as a teacher. And you need to be able to demonstrate your knowledge of that teaching strategies, that range of teaching strategies. We can't just teach in one way and expect all of our students to learn. And we'll explore, throughout this course, we'll explore different ways, different strategies, different ways of teaching, so that we can reach, meet the needs of all of our students and encourage them in their strengths. Also in Standard 1 are strategies around Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander students, impact of culture, cultural identity and linguistic background, specific learning needs and supporting full participation. So not just participation, but full participation. So you need to understand the legislative requirements and again, those teaching strategies that I talked about before. Okay, differentiation is 1.5 and we will explore that concept in great detail. And it would be, I'm very much aware of how much I still have to learn in terms of impacts of culture, cultural identity and linguistic background on the education of students from Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander backgrounds. Even though I am certified as a lead teacher against standards 1 and 2, I still have so much to learn. And it would be a wonderful thing if Australia was at a point where we had achieved reconciliation, but we haven't. And until we do, it's important for us to know that part of our job as teachers is to promote reconciliation. And to do that, we have to demonstrate knowledge and understanding and respect for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander histories, cultures and languages. The next domain is about professional practice. Now, inclusion comes up again in professional practice. So inclusive and challenging learning environments, fair and equitable behaviour management plans. We will talk about personalised learning and behaviour management plans. We'll have a whole week on that. And again, that effective repertoire of teaching strategies. We cannot teach everybody in exactly the same way. We need to know when we can use this strategy and when we can use that strategy. And we will only know that if we regularly evaluate what we're doing. We can't just teach the same thing over and over and over again. We actually have to evaluate what we're doing. We have to make sure that we're meeting the learning needs of the students that are in our classroom at this time, which could be quite different to what we taught last year or last semester or 3 years ago. And we need to use data to identify the barriers to learning and challenge our students to improve their performance. Now, the teaching and learning cycle is a thing. There are many elements to it, and some of us are more naturally suited, have better skills to start off with at different points in the teaching and learning cycle. Some of us are great at developing learning programs, but not so good at assessment. Some of us are fantastic teachers, but not great at providing feedback on learning to parents and carers. So we need to be aware of our strengths and aware of our weaknesses, and we need to build up our skills in all of these elements of the learning cycle. So this is what we're looking at for Standard 3. It's about planning and structuring and sequencing things and having challenging learning goals. Standard 4, here we go, inclusion again, supporting inclusive student participation and engagement. Also part of professional practice is Standard 5. This point about feedback, it's really important stuff. Research proves to us that the quickest, cheapest and easiest way to improve student performance is through timely and appropriate feedback. So this is something we all need to learn. So I will be doing my very best to model this for you when I'm providing feedback for you. So that feedback will include actual written feedback on your assessment. So strongly encourage you to actually read that. That would be good. Consistency and comparability. Assessment moderation is a really useful tool. I encourage you to explore it. And the final domain is professional engagement. As teachers, we have our own learning needs. And we need to analyse, evaluate and expand our professional capacity. We need to, so this is a thing that you will do every year as a teacher. This is ongoing. Lifelong learning is a thing, particularly for a professional teacher. Demonstrating respect and professionalism in all their interactions with students, colleagues, parents and carers and the community. effective communication. Now, I have an expectation that you will model that in your communications within our classroom and within the unit. So I expect to see professionalism in your emails to me and to any other member of the faculty. And I expect you to communicate appropriately with your peers. Teachers value opportunities to engage with their school communities. That link between school, home and community is incredibly important. Not always easy to manage, but incredibly important. So in this unit, strongly encourage you to seek and apply constructive feedback, whether that's while you're on prac or within the unit itself. If you need more feedback, please talk to me. I am very fond of people who seek and apply feedback. It's a wonderful thing. Something that I seek to do all the time. The rest of Standard 7, engaging with parents and carers is probably the one that is hardest of all of these. So we will have talked about the legislative and administrative and organisational policies and processes. So we'll be working on that within the tutorials. We'll be talking about the key principles of inclusion and codes of ethics. So you'll be covering off on those. Understanding the role of external professionals and community representatives. So again, that's where we talk about learning support assistants and so on. And the people within the education department whose job it is to help us do our job. Engaging with parents and carers is complex at times, particularly in an inclusion space. But what we need to remember is the vast majority of parents want the best possible outcome for their children and young people. And that's what we want as well. So we have this shared starting point. While we may be very different people, we have a shared starting point and we need to focus in on that and work from there. So that's the end of the lecture. If there's anything you'd like to explore a little more, I strongly encourage you to have a look at those references, and I look forward to working with you across the rest of the unit. Thanks very much, everybody.